absolutely free, thanks to the detested Mr. Lincoln, nowhere was it written that Negroes deserve to be absolutely equal. Judge Corbett and men of his class had gradually enshrined that inequality in law, and the highest court in the land had upheld their finding that separate but equal was good enough for everybody. Now the trial was less than a week away, and one huge question was still outstanding. Who would the state of Mississippi send to prosecute the case? "My sources in the capital have heard nothing about it," Japheth told LJ and me. "It's a big, holy secret." Chapter 93. A while later, the three of us were sitting on the west veranda of LJ's house, watching the sunset and sipping bourbon over cracked ice. "Well, you gentlemen are always acting so all-fired high and mighty," Japheth said. "But you've yet to give me a single piece of information that I can use. Why don't you start by sharing the names of the prosecution witnesses?" "Watch out, LJ. He's using one of his journalist tricks to get you to spill it," I said. "Me?" LJ scoffed. "What do I know? I don't know anything. I've been cut off by the entire town. I'm almost as much the person non grata as Mr. Nigger Lover Corbett. Everybody from here to Jackson knows whose side I'm on. And you know any friend of Ben Corbett's doesn't have another friend between here and Jackson." I clapped his shoulder. "I appreciate what you've done, LJ." It was right then that we heard a deep tenor voice, with a hint of something actorly in the round tones, accompanying a firm bootstep down the upstairs hall. "If you need a friend from Jackson, maybe I can fill the bill." We looked up to see a man whose appearance was as polished and natty as his voice. He wore a seersucker suit of the finest quality and a straw boater with a jaunty red band. He could not have been much more than 30, and he carried a wicker portmanteau and a large leather satchel jammed with papers. He introduced himself as Jonah Curtis and explained that he had been appointed by the state of Mississippi to prosecute the white raiders. "I had my assistant reserve a room at Miss Maybell's establishment," he said, "but Maybell took one look at me, and it turned out she had misplaced my reservation. She suggested I bring myself to this address." "Welcome to the House of Pariahs, Mr. Curtis," said LJ. "You are welcome to stay here in my home for as long as this trial takes." "I do appreciate that, sir. And please, call me Jonah." Jonah Curtis was almost as tall as I. He was what anyone would call a handsome man. And Jonah Curtis was one other thing besides. Jonah Curtis was a black man. Chapter 94. One important piece of the puzzle was still missing. Who would be defending the white raiders? The next morning, that puzzle piece appeared. LJ came rushing into the house yelling, "Those goddamn leaky slop buckets have gone and got themselves the best goddamn criminal defense attorney in the South." Jonah looked up from his book. "Maxwell Hayes Lewis?" "How'd you know that?" LJ asked. "You said the best." Jonah turned to me. "Ben, if you needed a lawyer to defend a gang of no-good lowlifes who viciously attacked a colored man's house, who would you get?" "Maxwell Hayes Lewis," I said. "And why would you want him?" "Because he got the governor of Arkansas acquitted after he shot his bastard son, his half-Negro son, in full view of at least 25 people. So, our little pack of rats managed to get themselves Loophole Lewis," Jonah said. "Loophole Lewis? That's how he was known wherever lawyers got together and gossiped about others of their species. Lewis's philosophy was simple. If you can't find a loophole for your client, go out and invent one. Jonah carefully closed his well-thumbed copy of the Revised Civil Code of the state of Mississippi. "You know, I have always wanted to meet Counselor Lewis," he said. Jonah must have made a special connection with the good Lord, because we were still sipping coffee 10 minutes later when LJ's butler announced that a Mr. Maxwell Lewis was there to see us. "I thought it would be the mannerly thing to do, to come by and introduce myself to you distinguished gentlemen of the prosecution," Lewis said, coming in. He was plain-spoken and plain-looking. My mother would have said he was plain as an old cornstick. Then she would have added, "But that's just on the outside, so you'd better watch yourself." We all told Mr. Lewis we were pleased to meet him. He said he was pleased to meet us as well. "No, thank you," he said. "No tea or coffee for him. Bourbon? Certainly not at this early hour," he said, although he asked if he might revisit the question somewhat later in the day. This display of Southern charm was not the reason for his visit, I was sure. Fairly soon he sidled up to the real reason. "I must say, Mr. Corbett, I was a mite surprised when I saw that the trial judge will be none other than your distinguished father," he said. "As was I said. Clearly he wanted me to say more, so I stayed silent. "It's an unusual choice, and highly irregular," he continued on. "My first instinct was to try to get a new judge from the powers that be in Jackson, but then I got to thinking about it. This is an open and shut case. Why bother causing a fuss? I'm sure Judge Corbett will preside with absolute fairness." "If there's one thing he's known for," I said, "it's his fairness. And already we find ourselves in agreement, Mr. Lewis. We also believe that this is an open and shut case. I'm just afraid the door will be shutting on you." Lewis chuckled at my sally. "Aha, we shall see about that," he said. "I've been checking on your record in murder trials up in Washington, D.C. And yours too, Mr. Curtis. We shall certainly see." Chapter 95. Over the next days, we transformed the sitting room off my sleeping quarters into the White Raiders' War Room, as LJ soon nicknamed our paper-strewn maelstrom of an office. Conrad, the Cosgrove brother who had survived the assault at Abraham's house, went up to Macomb every morning to collect every newspaper and pamphlet having to do with the upcoming trial. We hauled an old chalkboard up from LJ's basement and made 2 lists of possibilities, impossible and possible. Among the latter were some terrifying questions. What if Maxwell Hayes Lewis leads with a request for dismissal? Bang, the gavel falls, the case is over. What if Abraham is too ill to testify? What if he dies before or during the trial? Bang, the case is over. What if Lewis tampers with a jury? It wouldn't be too difficult in this town. What if we made our lists, erased them, improved and reworked them, and studied them as if they were the received word of God? After a few days working beside him, I decided that Jonah Curtis was not only a smart man, but a wise one. Jonah clearly had intelligence to spare, tempered with humor and a bit of easygoing cynicism, the result, I supposed, of growing up always seeing the other side of the coin toss we called justice. He was the son of a sharecropper who spent most of his life as a slave on a cotton plantation near Clarksdale in the Mississippi Delta. When Jonah got his law degree and passed the bar examination, his father gave him a gift, the gold pocket watch for which he'd been saving since before Jonah was born. It was a beautiful timepiece, but the chain, clumsily hammered together from old scraps of iron, didn't match its quality. Jonah told me that his father had made it himself, from a piece of the very chain that had shackled him to the auction block the last time he was offered for sale. Sometimes Jonah got a little ahead of himself with his legal theories, at least as far as LJ was concerned. A verdict depends on the culture of any given town, Jonah said. A man held for killing a Negro in New York City will have a very different trial and a very different outcome than a man held for the same crime in Atlanta. Bring him to Eudora, and again the crime and the resulting trial would be different. We might say this White Raiders case is sui generis. LJ sighed heavily. Talk English, for God's sake, he said. Down here we say sui when we're calling hogs. LJ already considered me the worst know-it-all in the room, so I left this for Jonah to explain. Sorry, LJ, it's Latin, said Jonah. Sui generis, of its own kind, literally of its own genus. In other words, this case, well, there's never been another one anything like it. Chapter 96. The chanting outside LJ's house grew louder. The voices came closer and closer. All white, not right. All white, we fight. I hurried to the balcony off the war room, with LJ and Jonah at my heels. An astounding sight our eyes met. There were black people, scores of them, 200 or more, slowly marching down the middle of Willow Street in Eudora, Mississippi. This was almost unbelievable. In the South, black people were not supposed to assemble in these numbers. LJ let out a whistle. That is one angry bunch of Negroes, he said. I think the word I would use is passionate, said Jonah. Though I had never expected to see black people marching through the streets, I knew instantly what this was about. Tomorrow, the trial would begin, and the first order of business was jury selection. No Negro had ever been permitted to serve on a jury in the state of Mississippi. Many of the liberal Yankee newspapers had declared it an outrage. They suggested that the Raider trial might be just the occasion for the presiding judge to allow one, or possibly even two, colored men to serve as jurors. We stood at the railing of the veranda, watching the marchers slowly pass. It was plain that they had taken a detour from Commerce Street to go past LJ's house. Some of them waved or lifted their hats to us. Just when we thought we had seen the last of the marchers, another phalanx turned the corner onto Willow. I was amazed. Gentlemen, are you seeing what I'm seeing? LJ smiled. Yes, sir, it's one hell of a crowd. Not just the size of the crowd, I said. Take a look at who's leading it. All white, not right. LJ squinted to see. Those two old folks at the front? Jonah answered for me. The lady is Ida Wells Barnett, he said. And the gentleman, if I am not mistaken, is Mr. W.E.B. Du Bois. This is history being made, indeed. Chapter 97. When I was a boy, my mother would sometimes take me to watch my father conducting a trial. It's a presiding day, she'd say. Let's go see Daddy scaring the pants off of everyone. And away we'd go to the courthouse. To my child's eye, the old Pike County Courthouse looked exactly like a church. The second-floor gallery where the colored people got to sit was like the choir loft. The benches below were the pews. And my father stood at the high altar in the front of the room, delivering thunderous sermons and running the whole thing like a very strict minister who happened to wield a hammer instead of a Bible. More than 20 years later, here I was, back in the